All right, continuing on with polygenic traits. Again, these are traits where there are multiple genes that are playing a role in its expression. And we typically get a whole continuum of expressions, like with height, right? You don't have people that are 6 foot and people that are 5'6". We get everything in between. Okay, and that's because there are multiple traits playing a role in that expression. Okay, polygenic, many different genes are influencing this trait. It could be 2, 3, 4, so on. Okay, so we look at something like eye color. And so this is an example of just two genes regulating eye color. I'm fairly certain it is more than two genes. And so this just looks at pigmentation. And so if you've got the dominant alleles, your eye color is going to be darker. If you've got the recessive alleles, eye color is going to be lighter. And so that's why we, for the most part, typically see more brown eyes than blue eyes and so on. Okay. But a lot of this is polygenic. And so we don't have brown eyes and blue eyes, right? There's hazel and green and all of these other random eye colors in there as well. Skin color is another excellent example where we've got multiple genes that are controlling the expression of this trait. And it's all about the amount of melanin in the skin. So the more dominant alleles an individual has, the darker their skin's going to be. The more recessive alleles an individual has, the less melanin that they're going to have in their skin. And so we get this whole continuum of skin pigmentation based on the alleles that individuals inherit. Okay. So here we've got individual A heterozygous for A, heterozygous for B, homozygous recessive for C. Okay. What will their approximate skin tone be compared to these other genotypes? Well, we're looking at the number of dominant alleles. So here in this situation, we've got two dominant alleles. So it's going to be most like A here, which also has two dominant alleles. Okay, and so they're going to have a very similar phenotype. Okay, this is just a quick little example of fraternal twins here. Okay, where they've got a half Jamaican mother, a Caucasian father. One of them ended up having much darker skin, the other light skin and red hair. Just because of that law of independent assortment, these chromosomes separated, and it's all about which chromosomes each daughter inherited. And when it comes to those genes for skin color, one daughter got more dominant alleles, the other more recessive alleles. Okay, and it's all because of this linked gene inheritance with the one daughter having light skin and red hair, right? Okay. Lastly, we're going to look at pedigrees here. And so pedigrees are a way that we can track genes through our genealogy, okay, through many generations. And so these are done with like those dogs that they take to dog shows and for horses because they want to see where these genes came from and what genes that we're looking at. Okay, so search medical historical family records. This is often used to track diseases as well that are genetic. And so we've got a family pedigree here. This one is just a silly one looking at widow's peak. But anytime you see a square, it's a male. Circles are females. If they're darkened in, that designates the specific trait that we're looking at, the phenotype, at least, of that trait. And if it's not colored in, that means they do not have that phenotype. Okay, so here we see a male, this grandfather with the trait that we're looking at. We see a male with the trait we're looking at, female with the trait, female without the trait, male without the trait, and so on. And so we can track the inheritance of whatever this trait is through multiple generations. So here we've got our widow's peak example. Okay, and so without knowing what these individuals were up here, okay, because it's possible you don't know what your grandparents had for maybe their expression, but you're not going to know their genotype. But if they have a child that is homozygous recessive, they both had to be heterozygous, right? Because they had to be able to pass on that recessive allele for whatever that trait is that we're looking at. Okay. Human genetics, inheritance, and disease, putting it all together. So we've got all of these recessive disorders where an individual has to have this recessive allele. So a lot of these disorders are just some mutation in this gene so that they're not producing a protein that functions correctly. Okay? Individuals that are heterozygous with these recessive disorders appear normal, but they're a carrier. So they could pass on that recessive disorder to their children. Okay? In order to have a recessive disorder, you've got to be homozygous recessive. You've got to have those two recessive alleles. In this case, for deafness, right? You've got two parents that are heterozygous, so they're both carriers. They don't express the disease, but they have a 1 in 4 chance of having a child with that disorder. In this case, deafness, because 1 out of 4 of those children are going to be homozygous recessive. Okay. And so this is just that congenital deafness here, recessive condition, and we don't splice correctly here. And so we don't build a protein that we need for this process of hearing. Okay. And so we can look at the inheritance of deafness in a family from Martha's Vineyard here. And so we see these children with the traits here, homozygous recessive. They went and had a bunch of children. And so we see a lot of these individuals, all of them are at least heterozygous for deafness. And so there will be a potential that they could pass that on because they're all carriers. Okay. But we see that these parents without deafness passed on to their children these deafness alleles, and he ended up deaf, even though the parents weren't. These parents up here, it's important to note, we don't know what their second allele is because they had a normal daughter. One of them is going to be heterozygous because they did pass on that recessive allele, but we don't know which. So we've just got question marks there. Okay. Tay-Sachs disease is actually a dominant allele. Lipids accumulate in the brain. And so these lipids will build up and it is typically fatal. And so individuals that have this disorder, I'm sorry, this one is recessive. That's my bad. Huntington's, which we may look at later, is dominant. If they've got both of these recessive alleles, it's usually lethal early on, but the disease doesn't disappear from the gene pool because individuals that are heterozygous are perfectly normal. Okay. And so here we see the probability. If we've got two individuals that are heterozygous carriers, we've got a 25% chance that they have a baby with Tay-Sachs disease. Okay. Here we've got Huntington's. Huntington's is a dominant disease, doesn't present itself until later in life, but is typically fatal shortly after its presentation. But all you have to have is one dominant allele here for this to have this disease. And so anytime this dad passes on that dominant allele to any of his children, they're going to have the disease as well. Okay. Lots of diseases are sex-linked, so we can follow these on pedigrees as well. If you've watched the other videos, you've seen we've done this in Punnett squares to look at these. In this case, males that have the one recessive allele have the disease. Females, because they have two X chromosomes, have to be homozygous recessive to have the disease. Okay, and so we'll talk about these various pedigrees in the next video.